Well, hello and welcome to yet another edition of Turning the Page. I'm Siddharth Talia and I'm privileged to be speaking to Mr. Uttam Kumar Sinha, the author of Trial by Water, the Indus Basin and India-Pakistan Relations. He's also the author of Indus Basin Uninterrupted, which preceded this work, and that was a comprehensive history of the Indus Basin all the way from Alexander to Nehru. Many thanks, Mr. Sinha, for speaking to me and sharing your insights on this extremely important development dating back to 1960, and it carries implications even to this day. Let me first begin by simply asking you about the circumstances in which this particular treaty had been inked 13 years after the independence of both India and Pakistan.
Well, first of all, thank you, Siddharth, for having me on your show. It's always a pleasure to talk about a book which you've been deeply involved with. And I've been involved writing this book, in fact, two books, as you just mentioned. Um, and my archival studies reveal a lot of historical sort of intrigue and content, but it also carries a lot of contemporary relevance. To answer your question, the circumstances, I think quite clearly the Indus Waters Treaty was born out of a uniquely volatile historical moment, the partition in 1947. I think it did not merely divide the territory, it fractured the very integrated Indus River system into two sovereign states, with, as you know, deep adversarial political identities. So the Indus Basin, which had functioned as a as a unified hydraulic network under the British administration, suddenly became a transboundary system without an agreed framework. So at the time of the partition, there were lots of issues to be dealt with, and the development of the Indus Basin was also a very important issue. And Cyril Radcliffe, the guy who actually drew the line, actually proposed a shared system under what is called joint control. But both India and Pakistan at that point of time, the mood was certainly not in favor of any reconciliation or any sort of cooperation at that stage, given the volatility of the partition. So both India and Pakistan rejected his idea of a joint control. In fact, very famously, and it's written in the book, Jinnah declared that he would rather have Pakistan's deserts than fertile fields watered by the courtesy of Hindus. And Nehru equally and very firmly responds by saying, what India did with India's rivers was India's affair. So it's a very famous line by both these statesmen, which quite clearly signifies the nature of the waters. So interestingly, the joint river management resurfaced again in the very chaotic period after 1947. There were lots of proposals to have third-party arbitration. There were lots of framework that came about to ensure that there is a smooth flow of the waters. For example, the US-Canada International Joint Commission. There were examples which were talked about, but these things did not fall in place. And it did not fall in place because on April 1st, 1948, India actually halted the Satluj at Firozpur, which of course was restored. Now, it was a technical halt. It wasn't done with any deliberate intention because, the ad hoc arrangement had expired on 31st of March. So they needed to have a new arrangement. And I don't think Pakistan was very clear in understanding what the arrangement would be. And so it sort of ignored the whole process and India technically stopped it. But, it created in the Pakistan's psyche the knowledge that India could actually manipulate the water and stop the flow. So, and I think this psyche still prevails very much even today. But soon after 1942, I think the whole idea of sharing water was based on a lot of mistrust. There was, a lot of institutional fragility. There was a lot of unresolved political settlements, etc. So I think they did require some approach that could settle the water flow between India and Pakistan. Also, I think, and to respond to the circumstances questions that you asked, let's not forget that there was a broader Cold War context prevailing in the 1950s. Pakistan's strategic alignment with Western security structures and India's policy of non-alignment shaped in a certain way how these two approached the negotiations on the Indus Waters. And then you had the third party coming in, the World Bank, and it became an instrument through which I think Western powers could stabilize a very politically fragile but strategically important region. They all considered the Indus Basin and the negotiation and the sharing of the waters to be a flashpoint in the relationship between India and Pakistan. So all these were adding sort of great impact onto the negotiation process. For Washington, I think there was a great strategic intent and interest in South Asia, and that's quite unmistakable. And the documents reveal, especially under the Eisenhower administration, that this for the U.S. The region was a critical frontier in its contest against the Soviet Union. So they were trying to draw both India and Pakistan into its anti-communist orbit, right?
Right.
And it was quite imperative for the US to get these two countries together, to get them going. And for that, they were giving plenty of aid, financial assistance. They were offering technical expertise. And the World Bank was facilitating the role.
So the entire treaty, of course, was also negotiated by civil engineers. It's very technical in
Yeah.
nature. We'll come to all of that, but just to sum it up for the benefit of our viewers, the treaty in a nutshell allows all waters of the eastern rivers to be available for unrestricted use for India. So you're talking about the Satluj, Beas, and Ravi. There are tributaries of the Indus. Pakistan shall receive for unrestricted use all waters of the western rivers, which are Indus, Chenab, and Jhelum. India is also entitled to a certain use on these western rivers, such as domestic use, non-consumptive use, agricultural use, and generation of hydroelectric power. Now, this is the treaty in a nutshell. Then, of course, Pakistan, according to the treaty, would get about 400 crores in grants to build canal systems. India would get about 27 crores in loans, 15 crores from the United States, 12 crores from the World Bank. We would also pay Pakistan 83 crore rupees at that point in time to build link canals to divert flow from the western to the eastern rivers. So this is pretty much what the treaty is about. And while you talked about what Eisenhower said, celebrating the treaty, the opposition at that point in time in India in 1960 had a different point of view. And they gave Nehru a very tough time in Parliament when he sought to defend this treaty. Why is it that
Yes.
the perception still holds within a strong section of the political class in this country, as it did back in 1960, that India had given too much away? And do you
Yeah.
believe that was indeed the case? What's your take on the matter?
Well, yes, I think there was an enormous opposition to this treaty. The treaty, as you recall, was signed on 19 September 1960. But the real window into its political meaning came a few months later, on 30th November, when the Lok Sabha debated it. And that debate is very interesting because it has a great deal of resonance to the debate that happened recently, I mean, last year in April. So I don't think if you carefully read the debate, and the questions that were posed and the way Nehru responded, I don't think the debate did not oppose the idea of a water sharing settlement. What it did was it integrated the cost of peace, the extent of India's generosity, and the trustworthiness of the partner across the table, that is Pakistan. So I think these elements, the cost of peace, the extent of India's generosity, and the trustworthiness, whether we should trust Pakistan or not, still governs our thinking vis-a-vis Pakistan. No one, I think, in the debate, and people were quite charged about the Indus Waters Treaty, but no one denied Nehru's approach of dealing with Pakistan, his government's what is called co-extensive and co-identical powers with the parliament. I mean, the government of the day has the right to form a treaty or to establish a treaty or to enter a treaty. It's called the co-extensive and co-identical powers. So no one actually denied that prerogative of the government. Yet I think many felt that on matters of such consequences like water sharing, consultations would have better served the nation. So, as you rightly said, the negotiation was between the civil engineers really and the political class, and even the diplomats, the professional diplomats were really kept out of the equation. Right. So it was a lot to do with technical understanding, technical detailing, hydrology, flow patterns, QSECs, BCMs, which people did not really understand. So I think it was felt in the parliament that there should have been more debate and consultation within the political class, and that is why there was a lot of misperception about the treaty. There were enormous criticism, and I think the biggest criticism, as I said, it was not so much to do with the sharing of the water. I think the criticism focused on the financial burden imposed on India. A country then struggling with economic fragility, and India committed to paying about pound sterling 62 million. That translated to about 83 crores over
Correct.
10 years to Pakistan for canal replacement. And Ashok Dua condemned it as a fiscally irresponsible act. Their objection, I think, were rooted in three principal concerns, as I said. First was the allocation, which they thought appeared very asymmetric. And this is the debate even today. We
Yeah.
say 20% of water only to India and 80% to Pakistan, which I think is not really correct, because uh, the treaty did not uh, determine the volumes of the basin. The treaty divided the rivers. So you had three western rivers going to Pakistan and three eastern rivers being controlled by India. So I think this volumetric debate, which happened then and which happens even today, one can understand because it's 80-20 and it favors Pakistan more. But I think that's not how the civil engineers thought about the treaty. The treaty was the separation of the basin with western rivers and eastern rivers, and the fact that we control the eastern rivers 100% was, I think, a significant strategic gain for India, because these rivers were Punjab rivers, and we needed the waters in Punjab to irrigate and to increase our food security, right? And even Pakistan needed the water for their Punjab, the West Punjab, and they were not very easy to give away the eastern rivers, but we negotiated very hard to return. So I think that the treaty did favor us in that sense, and so this whole idea of 80-20 in my mind and in my reading of the Indus Waters Treaty is not the correct way to look at it. Because if you look at the 80-20, certainly we have lost because we gave more water. But if you look at the significance of the eastern rivers at that point of time, then we gained strategically. Today, of course, it's not about the eastern rivers. Today, it's about the western rivers.
Absolutely, and we have the right of access to Western rivers to harness the Western rivers for our hydroelectric power purposes, etc.
Yes.
We haven't done it to
Yeah.
the extent that we ought to, and we'll
Yes.
come to that in a bit as well because Pakistan,
But
uh, yeah,
Siddharth, just with a little bit of hindsight, I think this criticism about India giving away too much water and the unfairness of the treaty, I think
hmm,
is partially valid.
hmm,
But I think analytically it's incomplete. If you don't read the treaty properly,
of
then
course.
you would not get to know what it is.
Yeah, and you sum it up very well. In fact, I want to quote to our viewers, one very important excerpt. You said the Indus Waters Treaty, far from resembling a matrimonial union, politically resembled a divorce settlement, characterized by
Mhm.
conflicting claims stemming from the partition and pervasive atmosphere of mistrust. I think the opposition's claims then, and a lot of the critics of Nehru who still criticize him today for the treaty, they claim that the alimony was too high. To put it purely in those
Hmm.
terms.
Yeah,
And
that's
apart from the alimony, perhaps we parted with too much, but that's something that you also that's a claim that you challenge to a certain extent because when you talk about the 80-20 metric here, that could be a misleading if
yeah,
one doesn't
yeah,
go into the fine print of what the treaty actually entails. But I
yeah.
want to come to another important point, and you spoke about what happened in 1948 and
Hmm.
how Pakistan has subsequently tried to exploit its status as a low riparian state to raise alarm bells, even within the international community, that India is going to overnight stop the flow of water and essentially
Yeah.
starve Pakistan. How successful has Pakistan been in trying to convey this kind of an impression? And how has it actually hurt our interests? Because each time we try to use the Indus Waters Treaty to leverage the access that we have to the western rivers to construct hydroelectric power projects, the Pakistanis have been very quick to approach tribunals and courts to
Yeah.
challenge India's actions. So, how successful has Pakistan been, and have we managed to counter them successfully?
Well, Pakistan has successfully positioned itself as a lower riparian from time to time with a very diplomatic and a strategic purpose. I think they have been quite successful. Generally, lower riparians around the world tend to create more empathy, sympathy, and they are regarded as the underdogs in the whole sharing water equation. So I think, given its geographical position, and the way it has framed its victimhood sort of approach, I think they've been quite successful. It has also very systematically, the leadership in Pakistan through the decades, very systematically politicized and amplified its lower riparian status to drive strategic advantages. And it takes several forms. Pakistan has frequently, as you said, framed India's hydropower projects, especially on the western rivers, as potential threats to its water security. And by doing so, it has elevated technical disagreements into political disputes. So it's very good at doing that, turning technical matters into a larger political dispute, because it catches the world's attention, it brings in people, it tries to mediate. And what is regarded as simple technical issues that can be resolved bilaterally becomes a political dispute with lots of outside interventions and interference. So that's its strategy. It's been quite successful. It has, as I said, repeatedly internationalized the Indus Basin, despite having signed the treaty, despite provisions of resolving differences within the treaty itself. So it's been successful in doing that. It's been successful in bypassing the mechanism of the treaty. So I think this strategy has worked. It has, I would regard this as institutionalizing victimhood narrative, in Pakistan. And instead of resolving insecurities, has provided a legal and political framework through which these insecurities can be continuously and articulated and reinforced. So we have to factor that in. I think this claim of exploitation must be treated with nuance. I think when you look at Pakistan's concerns are not entirely, I would say, constructed. They are rooted in real hydrological asymmetry. We have to understand that as well. As a downstream state, it does face inherent constraints, right? And we see this with our relationship with China. We do face inherent constraints as a lower riparian
That's
with
correct.
an upstream riparian. So this is a hydrological reality. But the thing is, these equations of upstream and downstream are negated through institutional mechanism. And this was the whole idea of creating a treaty. And this is what Pakistan deliberately tends to ignore, the
Yes.
value of the mechanism, and it emphasizes more on the nature, the geographical nature of these inherent constraints. So the critical distinction lies in the degree of politicization. While the vulnerability is real, and I guess we all understand that, as a lower riparian also we understand, its strategic deployment has often exceeded this empirical reality. It sort of embeds water into a broader security discourse that sustains mistrust. So what it has done very successfully, that it has securitized the entire water sharing with India. It has raised it to the level of political dispute despite the treaty. It raises it to the level of, at times, saying that it might also be a nuclear issue, given that if water is stopped, then it has the right to use its nuclear weapon. So you see the language and the nature of Pakistan understanding is very securitized. I think it works in their advantage. It works in the advantage of the establishment in Pakistan to keep the water issues on the boiling pot, to keep raising the passions within the domestic constituencies, so that you create the perfect enemy that India is.
Indeed, and now that the treaty is in abeyance, because this is a decision that was taken by our government after the Pahalgam terrorist attack in April last year, you've said that while India has been assertive in keeping the treaty in abeyance, the decision also treads a fine line between coercive diplomacy and legal ambiguity. It's a two-part question. What is the legal ambiguity here, firstly? And secondly, uh, how can we use the current situation to our advantage? Because have we been slow in protecting our interests as far as the Western rivers are concerned? And is this the right time to go ahead and construct a lot of these hydroelectric projects that constantly kept getting challenged? How can we leverage the situation to our advantage in terms of our access to the Western rivers? Final question.
Well, I think our recent approach to the treaty, I think, is a significant departure from its earlier posture of strict legal adherence. I think we followed the treaty very well because we thought we're committed to it. We've signed the treaty and therefore we abided by it. One of the fact that the treaty remained intact was India allowed it to function. You know, India could at several point of time would have disregarded it and put the treaty into a cold storage, but it did not. So I think there was in the nature of India to strictly adhere to the legality of the treaty. So to put the treaty in abeyance and sort of accelerate projects on the Western rivers, I think reflects a shift from the normative compliance to a more strategic assertion. And I think this is a fundamental change in the way this particular government feels about dealing with Pakistan, moving away from a normative compliance to a more strategic assertion. However, I think this shift operates within a very complex legal and political landscape. It's not a very easy situation. As you see, water sharing is not at all easy. It's multi-layered and very complex. And given the political situation with India and Pakistan, it becomes even more complicated. But from a legal perspective, I think the treaty does not explicitly provide for unilateral suspension. That's very clear. There is no exit clause in the treaty. That places India's action in a very gray zone, legally speaking,
Which is probably
where they
why we've
cannot.
used the word abeyance and not suspension ourselves.
Yes, that's right. Where they cannot really be fully justified through a narrow, textual reading of the agreement. So this does introduce an element of legal ambiguity, with potential implications for India's broader reputation as supporter of international law. However, having said that, however, sort of looking from the legality of it, I think one can see it in that manner. But at the same time, I think India's action can also be framed as a correction of historical underutilization of the provisions of the treaty itself. We are not escaping away from the treaty, but we are saying that, well, we've not used this treaty to our effective use. And for decades, India exercised restraint in exploiting its permissible rights on the Western rivers. So the current push to develop hydropower and the water infrastructure can therefore be seen as the delayed exercise in existing entitlements rather than the creation of new ones, right? So this duality creates a perception of what is called coercive diplomacy. While India is not overtly violating the treaty's technical provision, its action signals a harder political stance aimed at, sort of recalibrating the bilateral equation. So the fine line, as you mentioned, lies precisely here. If India remains within the engineering and design parameters allowed under the treaty, it retains legal defensibility, right? However, if its actions are perceived as deliberately pressurizing Pakistan by altering flow dynamics or accelerating projects for strategic signaling, they risk being interpreted as coercive. So I think that's the fine line India needs to take. So I have also, and I've strongly argued that, the political narrative, the strong nationalist narrative is that we should say that we will stop the flow of water to Pakistan. I say that's not the language to use given the fine line that we are in. What we should say is water for our development,
Yes.
water for Kashmiri's need. I
Yes.
think it constructs a semantic and a language which is far more powerful and far more in balance of things. So I think the stopping of water has always created disturbances and
Hmm.
gives us a very a kind of an image internationally that we do not really want that image to happen.
Absolutely. There's every scope for rhetorical restraint to be exercised in matters like these because the message that goes out is also very important. A final question, sir. Do you see the possibility of the restoration of this treaty? It's in abeyance. I mean, the treaty still exists. It's only in abeyance. India did, in fact, offer to renegotiate this, invoking Article 12 of the Indus Waters Treaty, and you mentioned that in the book as well. And that offer had been rebuffed by Pakistan. So India can also claim that if you feel that the treaty is dated, if it requires modifications, which we also feel the need to, perhaps Pakistan does as well. We at least gave you the opportunity to discuss it, but you decided not to. Do you see the possibility of this treaty being revived? Final question, sir.
Well, at this stage, the abeyance works very well for India.
Yes,
Abeyance clearly signifies that the treaty is not abrogated. There is still room for Pakistan, if it wants to negotiate the treaty and possibly renegotiate the future of this treaty and the basin. So that door is left a little open. However, what is now clearly linked to the Indus Waters Treaty is the behavior of Pakistan.
correct.
It has to give credible proof, irrevocable proof that its cross-border terrorism has stopped. And I think this linkage of cross-border terrorism to the functioning of the Indus Waters Treaty is something remarkably new
Yes,
in the history of this treaty. And I think that is quite clearly a policy line of India now. And
yes. I mean,
therefore, it is abeyance, not abrogation. Time for Pakistan to reflect its behavior with its riparian partner. We're not even saying its territorial neighbor, but its riparian partner, which shares the rivers, to
yes.
think about the elements of or the design or a new design of the Indus Waters Treaty. So actually, the ball is in Pakistan's court.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very well summed up, Mr. Sinha. And thank you so much for speaking to us about your book. Trial by water, once again, Indus Basin and India-Pakistan relations. It's a must read for anyone who wants to educate themselves about not just the Indus Waters Treaty, because the book has so much else. I mean, about how each
Yeah.
and every single development, including the wars, have left an imprint on how this treaty itself has evolved and the implications it carries. So many thanks, Mr. Sinha, once again for speaking to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Siddharth. Lovely talking to you.
Thank you, sir.